All right, guys, are there any questions on the homework assignments? Any guys? Any questions on the homework assignments? All right, guys, if there's no questions on the homework assignments, let's put the Chromebooks, computers away. Yes. Okay. Everybody's got a note sheet?
Yes, sir, I do.
All right.
What's mine?
What we're looking at first, and what we're looking at today, is classifying quadrilaterals based off their properties. Now, a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. A rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles, and a square is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. So we look at any of these here, we talk about them. We're going to use these properties to be able to name the shapes that we're given based off the information. And whenever we name a shape and it's just asking us to name the shape, we want to give the most specific. The most specific name for the shape based off the information that's given to us. So if we're just told that it is a quadrilateral, it has 4 sides, and they're all congruent, well, we could call it a quadrilateral, or we can call it a parallelogram or rhombus. But because rhombus is the most specific definition, we're going to use rhombus. Whatever is the most specific. Now we do have some properties here, or a corollary. A quadrilateral is a rhombus if and only if it has, because rhombus is if and only if it has 4 congruent sides. Now we'll get to the square in a minute. So any questions on the rhombus corollary? So if we have a 4-sided figure with 4 congruent sides, we're going to call it a rhombus. Now, a quadrilateral is a rectangle if and only if it has 4 right angles. So it is a rectangle if and only if it has 4 right angles. So a rhombus has 4 congruent sides. A rectangle has 4 right angles. And a square, if and only if it is a rhombus and a rectangle. A rhombus has what? 4 congruent sides. Congruent sides. And 4 right angles. No. Might think about it if you took notes and paid attention. Then you're good.
That's the bad thing about me. I get lost.
All right. So, if it is a square, it means that it has 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. Then we could call it a square. So any questions on any of this here so far? Now, guys, whenever we look at all these here and we categorize them in kind of groups, we can say that any of these here can be called a
quadrilateral
because they all have 4 sides. Because the most basic definition of these 4-sided figures is a quadrilateral, because it just means it has 4 sides. Now, kind of a subcategory of this we consider is, and this isn't in the notes, is going to be parallelograms. And we came up with different ways last week of being able to prove that a figure is a parallelogram. But the biggest part is that a parallelogram has two parallel sides. We also saw that the opposite angles inside of a parallelogram are congruent, and the opposite sides in a parallelogram are congruent. And the corresponding, or the consecutive angles, the angles next to each other, add together to be 180. Well, inside of this here, we do have our rhombus. And we also have rectangle. And a square is kind of a combination of both a rhombus and a rectangle. Now, can a square be a rhombus?
Yeah.
Can a square be a rhombus? Because a square is a rhombus and a rectangle. So a square can be a rhombus, but not every rhombus can be a, if it has four right angles. But any other rhombus will not be a square. So any square can be a rhombus, but not all rhombuses can be a square. Can a square be a rectangle? Yes, but not all rectangles can be a. So now the rest of this here, what we're doing is really classifying these triangles and talking about the properties, not triangles, but the properties of these quadrilaterals. So, guys, let's focus in here. For any rhombus, QRST, decide whether the statement is true always or sometimes true. Logan, let's focus on this here. Now, guys, let's look at this here. So for any rhombus, QRST, so what we're looking at here is a rhombus. Now, by definition, a rhombus has four congruent sides. So all four sides would be congruent.
How do you classify a circle?
As a circle.
But like, is there different circles?
Well, it wouldn't be called a circle.
Like a sphere, a round. No point.
Circle.
A circle's a circle. Wait, would a circle be?
And we'll go into definitions of circles later because we already have a check.
Different kind of circle, like equilateral circle.
No. So, looking at this, guys, looking at this here, we are asked to determine whether the statement Q, angle Q is congruent to angle S is sometimes or always true. Why? Because a rhombus is also a what? And a rhombus is a as we went over last week, the opposite angles in a parallelogram are congruent. So always, because this is always true, as the opposite angles in a parallelogram are congruent, and that's a topic for later. That's a topic for another time. And because the rhombus is a parallelogram, it means that these two angles are going to be congruent. Let's look at the next one. For any rhombus, QRST, decide whether the statement is always or sometimes true. So again, we do have that all four sides are congruent. Because it's a parallelogram, we know that the opposite angles are congruent and the opposite sides are congruent. Now this is asking for us to determine whether Q and R would be congruent.
Like that's the answer?
Sometimes. When would it be? Because there's one case. If they are both what? Both 90 degrees. And essentially it would be a square. Because the consecutive angles at a parallelogram add up to be 180. 180 degrees. The four sides would not be congruent. Now, the only way that those two angles can be congruent and add together to be 180 is if they're both 90 degrees. So that'd be the only time that these two angles could be congruent. Questions on this here? All right, guys, let's look at the next one. Tyler? Guys?
Rectangle. But can it classify as a rectangle since it don't have?
Yeah, we're not sure that it's rectangle. It just kind of looks like a rectangle.
Oh, AB equals BC.
What?
Guys, for any rectangle ABCD, decide whether the statement is always or sometimes true. Explain your reasoning.
AB equals BC. That's wrong. That's wrong. It's visually not. Yeah. The square. But we're not talking about vision. It doesn't make sense.
You gotta know.
For
I don't care.
We're not talking about visual here.
Okay, if all wait. If that was true, then AB and BC are like congruent. Wouldn't it be a square then?
Yeah, that's my question.
thus,
That's why
it,
sometimes.
Oh, it would be a square.
But it's not. Because I'm
Because it's a
so
rectangle.
so smart.
well, Tyler, for any rectangle. So we use this here to be able to visualize it, but we're talking about any and all rectangles.
This doesn't match up to be that.
Well, that's any rectangle is said.
It's just a picture.
As a visualization.
Now, what if it said any rectangle that's not a square?
There would be never.
Like never ever.
Guys,
If all angles are 90 and all angles are congruent or all sides are congruent,
then it would be a
square.
square.
I think AB does equal
So
C.
that's just a long square.
Always. It always equals.
This would be
Always.
Because it's a parallelogram.
yes.
I say we break out the old measurements.
This side will always be.
Well, if you want to break out the measurements, you'd have to measure any and all possible rectangles that ever existed. Because it says for any rectangle. No, this is just a case.
Yeah, this side's
You're too fixated on this one picture because it's not talking about just this. It's talking about any figure, any four-sided figure that satisfies the definition of rectangle, four right angles. Yes.
Can we stop looking at the shape and just pay attention?
Yeah.
I mean,
Any questions on this?
maybe.
So, for any JKLM is always or sometimes true. Is it always or sometimes true that JK is perpendicular to KL? So by definition, a square has
That is always
Both congruent sides, both congruent angles.
I have a question. So this, like, learning videos that kids watch, if they're saying this is a square, are they lying to you? Yes.
sure. They obviously are.
Well, any square will look like that.
because if it has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides, then it is a square.
But that's true.
I told you it was a circle.
Questions on this here?
Now,
Yes.
How do you know that it has all congruent sides and congruent angles?
Because it's told us.
Well, are they for real? They're probably fine. Looks like it. No, hold on. They're probably fine.
Because what is the definition of a square?
For any square,
Tyler, definition of a square.
it has 4 right angles.
And
4 congruent sides.
so just by telling us this here, we know that it has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides.
For any square,
But
JKLM.
that's his point. He's asking one of the people who told us that that's 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. What if they lied? What if it's not?
Well, then. But back on the other one, that was a rectangle. Clearly a rectangle.
We are moving on. We are moving on.
Society is fine. Hey, it's a square, just the way you turn your head.
I think it doesn't look like a square.
It looks like.
because
So,
it's like,
by definitions, so it is a quadrilateral because it has what?
4 sides.
4 sides. Now, what else do we know? We have 4 congruent sides. So, which definition talked about having 4 congruent sides? A rhombus, which also means that it's a parallelogram because rhombus, square, and rectangle are all parallelograms.
Yeah, now we're getting somewhere.
Now, since one of them is 70, we know it can't be a rectangle because rectangles have 4 right angles.
90.
And it can't be a square because squares also have 4 right angles. So the most specific definition that we can have is rhombus. And that's it. That's all you have to do is call it a rhombus. Special quadrilateral. It is a rhombus. So these here tell us that we have 2 sets of parallel sides. So that means it is a parallelogram.
What are the lines?
Yeah, what are the
Wrong.
lines? That's wrong.
That these 2 sides are
Congruent?
congruent. We also know that in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are.
Congruent?
So that means that these 2 would both have 1, and
So that's
So that's a square. No,
now, do we know anything about the angles? No. So at most, we can call it a rhombus. If we knew the angles and knew that one of them at least was 90 degrees, then we could say it's a square or a rectangle. But here, the most we can call it is a rhombus.
squares defined by sets.
4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. If we have both of those, then it is a square. So, this is the last part of the lesson. We want to state all possible names. The first one? Now, let's look at number 1. So it does have 4 sides, so we can call it a
Make that look 3D.
quadrilateral. Quadrilateral, because quadrilateral means it just has 4 sides. Now, we do have all right angles, so we can call it a rectangle. and is a rhombus. Now, because it is a rectangle and a rhombus, it automatically is a it is also a
That's a square, not a
because by definition it is all of these here. Because a rectangle, rhombus, and square are all a parallelogram. So really, if it is a square, and we're listing all the names, all the possible categories, we're listing all of them. Any other questions on the first one here? So, we know that it has four sides, yes? It's a quadrilateral. Do we know anything about the side lengths? Do we know anything about them being parallel? Do we know anything about the angles? So the most we can say is that it has four sides.
Yeah, that's right. Nope, that's a rectangle,
Yes.
but it's not a square.
It's also a quadrilateral
It's a quadrilateral
and a parallelogram.
Quadrilateral and a
rhombus.
It's not a rhombus. Because if
What?
it was a rhombus too, then it'd be a square.
Oh, fair enough. It's not a rhombus.
because a rhombus would be four congruent sides.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot.
That next one's a rhombus.
That's not either.
So let's start out with the most
Actually, I don't know.
broadest category would be a
Quadrilateral and a parallelogram.
Yeah,
I don't think it is.
it's not a rhombus.
quadrilateral.
Side.
You can't tell if it's a rhombus or not. It doesn't tell.
The arrows.
The arrows just tell us whether it's parallelogram.
At the opposite sides. And we have two sets of parallel sides. So that means it is a parallelogram
But it's not a rhombus.
because we don't know anything about the sides lengths. We know that the opposite sides are congruent because it's a parallelogram. We also know that the opposite angles are congruent
Wait, but if the
because it's a parallelogram.
it would have to be.
But a rhombus would mean all four sides were
Sides are the same.
It could be that all four sides are the same, but since we are not told that all four sides are the same, we can't assume it to be true. I realized this morning I do have two number 5s. Let's look at number 8.
That's a quadrilateral. And a square. No, it's not a square.
It's not a square.
It's a parallelogram.
And it's a rectangle.
What?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a rectangle because that's a rectangle. That's not only right angles. Bam.
4 right angles. It has 4 sides, so it's a quadrilateral. It is a parallelogram because the opposite sides are congruent, which means that they are parallel. We also have that the opposite angles are congruent, which means it's parallelogram. 4 sides. Any figure with 4 sides is automatically a quadrilateral. Any questions on this here?
8 minus 4 is 4.
Let's look at number 10.
Take into account that 4 plus 8 would be 12.
That doesn't make sense.
Guys, put the desk down. Thank you. All 4 legs. So, we have 2 left. Number 10. If we look at this here, we can call it a quadrilateral because it has. Do we have the opposite sides congruent? Do we have the opposite angles congruent? No. So can it be a parallelogram? Well, if it's not a parallelogram, can it be a rhombus, rectangle, or square? No, because those are all parallelograms. So that's just a quadrilateral.
No,
got
a quadrilateral,
4 equal sides.
and it is a parallelogram.
Yeah.
Are all 4 angles congruent?
No,
No, so it can't be a rectangle or a square.
that's what I should.
Any other questions on this here?